dose-dependent effects of amphetamines. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the things that amphetamines do at low to moderate doses. First is some of the effects that are associated with higher doses of amphetamines. Okay, so I think I've already mentioned that amphetamine improves performance on tasks that require sustained attention and concentration. This is one of the reasons that they are useful in treating ADD, ADHD. So again, they improve the performance on tasks that require sustained attention and concentration. They also improve performance on tasks that require quickness and strength. Um, People tend to somehow feel like they are stronger and more capable under the influence of amphetamines. Some of that might be related to the fact that you have delayed onset of fatigue, and so if the individual has trained longer, harder, but also with short-term use, you could see, an individual um, that seems to have some superhuman um, strength or abilities. We've talked about a little bit about the effects on um, mood, whereas at lower doses you get the high, the elation that people are seeking. Um, but when they're coming down, okay, you have that letdown or the depression that then follows. Individuals also report increased levels of alertness under the influence of amphetamines. Okay, now let's talk about what happens at higher doses. Okay, typically what happens is that the tasks that show improvements at lower doses are usually inhibited by the larger doses of cocaine. Okay, so large or high doses of cocaine tend to impair the task for which you see improvements at low doses of cocaine. Okay, high doses of cocaine in terms of mood. I'm going to combine the mood and mental state because you have an increased risk for psychotic break, psychotic episode, the schizopsychosis. And in terms of movement, the individual will slow down. Their movements are slower, sometimes scooting, okay? Sometimes scooting around, okay? And so, in terms of the locomotor activity here, the individual mentally um, is okay, but in terms of um, movement, their overall movement is impaired, and so you may have an individual who actually, appears to be uh, much, much older than what they are because of those effects. Okay. All right. So I've already mentioned in several places the possibility of a psychotic breakdown due to the heavy use of amphetamines, but we also want to make sure that we emphasize that it doesn't have to be chronic, long-term heavy use, but that a single large enough dose of amphetamines could cause the psychotic break, the schizopsychosis that we've talked about before. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the symptoms of amphetamine um, psychosis. Okay, so the first thing that we'll talk about is the symptoms that they share in common with cocaine. Remember, with cocaine, we said that the individuals would experience and tactile, visual and tactile hallucinations, imagining that they're seeing bugs crawling on them, imagining that they feel like bugs are crawling on them. So, amphetamine also produces the visual and tactile hallucinations. Okay, now the second thing here is that amphetamines tend to be associated with auditory hallucinations. Okay, so while they share in common with cocaine the visual and tactile hallucinations, amphetamines are also associated with auditory hallucinations, so they're hearing things. Okay, and then with 3 and 4, you have delusions of persecution. Okay, so everybody is out to get you. And then 4, you have delusions of grandeur, where you're invincible and that you can do anything. You have these superhuman strengths, you can fly, you're just invincible. But remember, at the same time, you've got these feelings of persecution. Okay, so visual and tactile hallucinations, they share that in common with cocaine. Then you've got the auditory hallucinations. Okay, then you've got delusions of persecution and delusions of grandeur. Okay, binging. Okay, is associated with caffeine. Not caffeine. Binges are associated with amphetamine sprees. Excuse me. Remember, I said that we talked about the fact that the blood levels peak anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours. Okay, and remember that the effects of amphetamines are much longer lasting. Okay, so there's a possibility, or oftentimes you'll see users, administering amphetamine in a manner that reflects these longer lasting effects. And so the individual may self-administer amphetamines roughly every 4 hours or so, but you also tend to see some other, variations of that. Okay, but essentially you're doing several hits, okay, over the course of the day, be it separated by 4 hours or even less. Okay, now associated with this binge spree, so they're doing these sometimes often days of using cocaine in these 4-hour binge patterns. And then typically what happens is when they're doing that, they're going to continue that behavior for a while, because remember, these drugs delay the onset of fatigue. So even though they've been up potentially for days, the fatigue has been delayed. Okay, and so during that time, they may not eat much, they're not going to sleep much, until the drug runs out and they have to stop. Okay, but by that time they've been awake for several days at a time, and so when they do sleep, they may sleep for a day or two. Okay, and then when they get up, they'll use whatever resources they may still have available to get food, because their hunger has increased. So they'll eat food, and then typically, they might get access to the drug again and start this pattern, this binging pattern all over again. Okay. Now, usually once people have gotten to this level of use where they're doing these, 3 or 4 days of using the drug and then sleeping for a day or a day and a half, and then waking up and using the drug already, by now their interpersonal relationships have more than likely been adversely affected by the drug use, as would have been any job type relationships. Okay. Now, we've already said that the major symptom of amphetamine withdrawal is depression. Okay, and is its severity severity dose related? Absolutely. Similar to cocaine, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Okay, and so you've got individuals that may be addicted to this long term, okay, using very high doses. The depression that they're going to experience afterwards is going to be pretty severe. Okay, now just briefly, why are amphetamines and amphetamine-like drugs useful in treating ADD? Okay, the big answer is that they divert the brain's resources from other activities to the tasks that require sustained attention and concentration. Okay, so again, they're diverting the brain's resources toward tasks that require sustained attention and concentration. Now, one of the theories about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, attention deficit disorder, is that it may be caused by decreased dopaminergic activity in the frontal cortex. And so one of the hypotheses is that the reason that amphetamines and amphetamine-like drugs are useful in treating ADD, ADHD, is that because they increase dopaminergic transmission, that that may correct the low levels or the imbalance of dopamine levels in the frontal cortex. Okay, now the second reason that the amphetamines and the amphetamine related drugs are useful in treating ADD, ADHD. Well, I've already talked about diverting the brain's resources and talked about the fact that it could, you know, reverse, at least partially, those deficits in dopamine in the frontal cortex. I've actually talked about those things. Sorry, I don't want to mention anything else here. Cocaine, amphetamines, both of these at low doses decrease food and water consumption. How do they decrease food and water consumption? Well, one way is that these drugs are activating the same area of the brain, hypothalamus, which is involved in our food regulation, regulatory behavior. So that is one of the ways that these drugs decrease food and water consumption. The other is because resources in general are directed elsewhere. So if time in terms of resources or money in terms of resources is being spent getting cocaine, okay, then that is time and money that's not spent eating, okay? So those I've talked about, okay? So activates the area of the brain that is involved in food regulatory behaviors, the hypothalamus. And then second way is that resources, both financial and time, are diverted elsewhere, okay? And that's it for cocaine, or the psychomotor stimulants, excuse me.